So this photo, like almost all of my macro photos, is taken using a technique called focus stacking, where you take a series of photos at different focus points and combine them later in post to get a photo with more depth of field. And this is a very important technique in macro photography because you're very limited at high magnifications and the depth of field that you can get. But it can seem like quite a daunting technique at first. It's quite challenging when you first look at it. Now, some cameras have a function called focus bracketing, where the camera automatically changes focus for you during a burst series, and all you have to do is just hold the camera still. But this only works with autofocus lenses. So if you have a lens like this, which is the Laowa 65mm, this lens does not have autofocus. It's manual focus only, which means that focus bracketing does not work. And there's a few different techniques for shooting focus stacks with manual focus lenses, so fully manually, and I thought this would be a good opportunity to use this video to show you my main technique and what I think is the best technique to get consistent results. So what I do is I shoot in burst mode, the fastest burst mode I can, and pretty much just move the camera forward during this burst series to change the focus. So I end up with each shot being at a slightly different focus point. And to show you this technique more specifically, I've found these very cool looking fungi on a branch here, and I'm just going to show you this technique. So I'm shooting in burst mode at 15 frames per second, and I'm going to focus near the front of my subject, and then as I shoot, basically just move the camera forward. So I'm going to start at the front, start a burst, and then move forward. So this technique can be quite a challenge at first, and it takes a lot of practice to get really good and consistent at focus stacking fully handheld and manually like this. But I find that once you do get good at this technique, it's much more consistent, and I can get much more consistent results than if I use a technique like turning the focus ring while shooting in burst mode. Because when I'm turning the focus ring, then I need my hand to be doing that, and if I just move the camera, then my left hand can be fully focused on keeping the camera stable. And that brings me to what is probably the most important aspect of manually focus stacking like this, which is stability. And this varies a lot depending on where your subject is. It can be very different ways of keeping your camera stable. So for example, if I've got a subject on this log, then I would rest my left hand on the log, rest the lens on the tip of my fingers of my left hand, and then I can kind of use my fingers to guide the camera forward and backwards. But if I've got something that's sitting on a branch, I would hold the branch in my left hand, rest my lens on my wrist, and then push forward and backward like that. And this takes a lot of practice, and it's also just varies so much depending on where your subject is that you just need to figure out what works best depending on the different situation. But generally, I would recommend using your left hand to stabilize your camera while shooting a burst like this, because it really is key to keep as stable as you possibly can for this technique. So in this case, as an example, I found a small millipede here, and like I mentioned, I'm just resting my hand on the log, holding the lens with my fingers, and then as I shoot a burst, like before, moving the camera forward slightly. And that's honestly most of what you need to know for this technique. It's just about keeping as stable as you possibly can and then getting this very smooth motion while shooting in burst mode. And of course, you'll have to adjust the speed of movement depending on how high magnification and what a deep stack you want to do. And this just takes practice to be able to estimate this well on the first try. The other thing is that not all camera and flash combinations will be able to shoot in such fast burst modes. And again, this is just figuring out your equipment. So some cameras will only be able to do 10 frames per second or 5 frames per second. This makes it slightly more challenging just because you have to stay stable for longer the slower your burst rate is, but it's still very much possible. And the main thing with that, if it isn't a limitation of the camera, it's a limitation of the flash. And the trick with this is to use a low enough flash power to be able to recharge the flash between each shot. Now, if you want to know more about the settings for macro photography and for focus stacking, I've done a very in-depth video on macro photography settings a few months ago, so you can go check that out if you want a deeper dive on settings. So that's all I've got planned for the tutorial, but I thought I would continue on and see if I can find a few more subjects to photograph as kind of an example for this technique. And the first thing I found is I just thought I would check underneath the bark of this pine tree, because there's always interesting subjects to be found underneath the bark of fallen pine trees. And one of the things I was hoping to see is a running crab spider, or Philodromos margaritatus, which is one of my favorite spider species to photograph. And I got lucky, and under one of the first bits of bark I flipped over, I actually found a very nice looking individual right here. This is a male, as you can tell by these large swollen pedipalps in the front, and I'm just going to try and get a stack of that. I'm using the Laowa 25mm at fairly high magnification, and like I explained before, I'm just getting as stable as I can by resting my hand here and then resting the lens on my hand, and then I'm just going to move forward slightly while shooting in burst mode to get the photos for my focus stack, assuming I can find the spider. There it is. So here I found what is one of the craziest scenes I've seen in a long time, which is a pseudoscorpion that appears to have caught a globular springtail, and it's just sitting there next to it, probably feeding on the springtail. Really crazy scene, and I've never been able to photograph anything like this, so that's really cool. And I'm going to try and get as many photos as I can to document this. So now that you know how to take the photos for focus stacking, the next step is, of course, combining them properly in software on the computer. And this is a whole other big topic. I'm working on a separate video on this, which will hopefully be out in the next couple of weeks, so stay tuned for that. But for now, I hope that this has helped give you a bit of an overview of how to shoot focus stacks manually and fully handheld, and of my technique for doing so. And yeah, thank you very much for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.